I just want to welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Ryers. I'm class of 1990. I'm one of the co-presidents of the Brown Club of Greater San Francisco. And I just want to thank our extended Brown alumni family, our hosts here locally, John and Ann. And I also just want to thank all of you for participating in our first edition of the OneBear, OneBook book alumni-wide book club. So this basically grew out of an idea that we wanted to increase the connectivity between our Brown alumni all across the country, globally if possible, and kind of tap into that intellectual curiosity in real time that we all experienced at Brown. So today we are discussing a book called The Dreamt Land, Chasing Water, Dust Across California by Mark Arax. And we're very lucky to have Mark with us beaming in from Fresno. I got asked multiple times why we picked this book to be our pioneer book. And the reason was, again and again, this was the book that classmates, alumni, friends kept telling us, you gotta read this book. So that was the criteria, and well-deserved criteria for its part in our club. And I'm going to pass it off to our moderator tonight. He is a writer himself, Zac Unger, class of 96, as well as the president of Oakland Firefighters Local 55. So welcome, Zac. Welcome, Mark. If you have questions, go ahead and just drop them into chat and we'll get to them at the end of the hour. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. If any of you all, I have a bunch of questions that I am planning to ask, but if any of you all have questions, put them in the chat and I can sort of moderate them. I want to thank you all for being here. And especially I want to thank our guest, Mark Arax. He's a journalist, a memoirist, a backyard gardener, a barbecuer of lambs, a Fresnan, a father, and our guest here tonight. So thank you so much for being here. The book was really a pleasure to read. And I just want to jump right in. I mean, it's a book about water, but it also strikes me that it's a book about the belief in magic and magical thinking, the idea that rain always follows the plow and that rivers can be made to run backwards and sorcerers can coax water out of the clouds and cities can exist below the water level. And so it's a book about magic, and it's a book about illogic and bad decision making and bad judgment. And I'm wondering what you think it is about water that inspires such fantastical beliefs and errors in judgment. Why do we make such bad decisions about water?
You know, it's a great question. I know that that the magic. I mean, when I delved into Hatfield, the Rainmaker, for instance. I mean, you could write a whole book on him, and I believe, you know, one has been written. It's just, you know, water. It's so essential, and it in a place like this, you can never take it for granted. And in California, we ended up, you know, taking on an experiment. I mean, you look at it. It's just the hubris involved in this place, you know, drawing a line around a land that's 1,000 miles long and declaring it one state, when in fact it's got, you know, a dozen different states of nature inside it. You know, far north, you get 140, 50 inches of rain a year. Down south, 3 or 4. And to try to even out those differences is you know, it's quite an endeavor, and it's doomed from the outset. But we've managed to get along for a while, and now as climate change is hitching on to these own inherent disparities and you know, the whipping between flood and drought in California, that's kind of our DNA, and now climate change hitching onto it. I think we're facing the limit line of this system, and we're seeing havoc that we've never seen before. And that's kind of where I'm stepping in this book, and throwing everything in. No, water is simply, the rivers are kind of metaphors. You know, the book is reportage, it's historical excavation, it's memoir, um, it's essay. I just throw everything in, hoping that I can keep the reader stuck to the page to get through the story.
Yeah. Well, I think you did a wonderful job with that. When you said that California is multiple states glued together, part of me wonders why that didn't work out better for California. It seems that when you have control at a larger level, you might be able to have economies of scale or sort of synthetic thinking. Why do you think it is that California ended up being as fractured as its landscape rather than having a sort of carefully considered central plan out of Sacramento?
Well, there was no planning, and it's taken California, which it regards itself as, and rightfully so, as a progressive state. It's taken us 170 years to regulate the extraction of groundwater. We're way behind all these other states. We've just done that. I think there was this sense, the myth of California, that no limits applied. And when you track, one of the things the book does is it follows the footprint of agriculture as it moves out from the alluvial plains of the rivers where agriculture makes great sense, to then it moves to more marginal land, more problem land, where getting the water there requires, intricate systems of ditches and canals and dams. And then finally, it moves even, farther out onto ground that should never be farmed, but is farmed because we've invented this kind of drip irrigation system in which you can deliver a precise dose of water and chemical to a root zone. And you can grow an almond tree, a pistachio tree, a mandarin in ground that has no fertility, because you deliver the fertility, almost like an umbilical cord. So we see agriculture going from something that was sustainable 100 years ago to less and less sustainable. And now it's, to to follow the dictates of this new law, we're looking at, probably 1.5 million acres of farmland in California out of the total of 8 or 9 that's going to have to be fallowed. I don't know if I've answered either of your questions, but I think we're moving around a little bit.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah.
Just sort of to get back to the sort of the original sin of California water policy, can you talk a little bit about why how water rights are different in the West than they are in the East, and why we sort of got off track with how people own water and who has the rights to water, and how settlement here is different than east of the Mississippi?
So, let's go back to the development of California a little bit. The first taking of a resource in California was the taking of the body of the native. And that was done by the Spanish colonial system and the friars coming here, and Junipero Serra. And so when you captured the body of the Indian, you were able then to capture the first flows of the rivers. And there were crude dams and canals and ditches that served all the missions in California. And there was this profusion of fruits and vegetables and wheat and cattle that grew on the missions. So very early on, that taking, and that taking occurred through the the capture of the Indians, and then the eventual genocide of the Indians. And then you see California getting supercharged in a way that really has less to do with manifest destiny than it has to do with extraction. And that is the discovery of gold in 1849, that shout of Eureka. And almost overnight, 80,000 people from all over the world coming to California to get rich. And very few of them did. The ones that did get rich were the merchants who ended up selling the supplies and the food to the gold camps. So when you look at gold mining, mining gold is really mining water, and it's the capture of water. And the more water, the more force of water that you can put on mountainsides, the more you can extract gold. And so you see some famous early photos of California, the Malakoff diggings, where these little, they called them monitors, the giant, these little uh, ways to capture water and put it in a line, and then have a nozzle at the end of that line. That whole propulsive force ends up melting mountains to extract the gold. And in the 1880s, California has a choice. Do we continue to mine gold and pollute the rivers and pollute the alluvial plains, or do we allow agriculture to take over? And that's a Supreme Court decision that basically says that mining needs to stop, agriculture needs to rise. And so you have these combination of laws that really go back to the gold mining, which is first right. The first person who claims a river gets a certain flow of that river. And the flow is never quite determined. So that when you look at some of the early capture of the rivers in the 1880s, they were 100 times the greatest flow of that river on paper. There was no way to give all that water to all those folks that were claiming it. And so literally it had to be resolved in court. And so you had two kind of laws. One was a riparian right, which meant that if you bought land along a river, you then had a right to take that water from the river, as long as your taking did not interfere with the right of someone else along the river, which is, obviously a very complicated thing. First in, first right. Then it was decided that, well, wait a second, we shouldn't just allow people who buy land along a river to control a river. For instance, Henry Miller, who came from Germany, arrived in San Francisco, became the cattle king of the West. He owned basically the riparian rights to two, if not three, major rivers in California. This was seen as unfair. And so the idea was that if you bought land in the alluvial plain of a river, you could, by ditch and canal, convey water from the river to your land, and that was an appropriative right. So California married these two rights, which were not compatible, actually, into this very strange law that has served us today. It's basically served the lawyers, though, because of the litigation that it takes to resolve the conflicts. And all of our rivers, the river basins, many of them have been litigated. And it's this combination of rights that go back to the 1840s, 1850s, and then modern day purchasing and moving. So, I mean, so it's a bit complicated, and but that's kind of the system we're operating under, and it's the reason why things have gone into the ground now, and extraction from the aquifers.
Yeah, you touched on something at the beginning of that answer that I want to go back to, which was about the subjugation of the First Nations folks living there as a way of as sort of a precursor to agriculture and the using of water in California. And it strikes me that your book is about a sort of legacy of various ethnic and national diaspora, one after another, coming to California, getting the short end of the stick, and then either working themselves out of that or not. And I wonder if agriculture in California is possible without the creation of either a temporary or a permanent underclass. I mean, you talked about that a little bit with the current sort of Mexican the use of people from Mexico and whether they'll ever be able to acquire land of their own. And so I'm wondering whether is agriculture in California possible in a sort of way that's consistent with our human rights goals and our civil rights goals.
Well, the crops that are now being planted are more mechanized, and so the acres rely less on human hands than they did. Let me take this into slightly narrative, because it speaks to why people journey here. I'm in Fresno, California, in the middle of the state. I'm in a suburban landscape. There's ranch houses all around me. I'm literally in a house that is a mile from the house I grew up in, an adobe brick house. Um, my sister lives a couple blocks on one side of me. My brother lives a couple blocks on the other side of me. You would not know, living here, growing up here, that surrounding us was the greatest agricultural experiment in human history. Um, I grew up in the suburbs. My father, they sold the farm before I was born. They went into the grocery business. We had 5 peacock markets in Fresno with these beautiful fluorescent signs, giant iridescent peacocks in full plumage. I remember that very vividly. And then one day my dad came home and said that he had bought a restaurant. He was getting out of the grocery business because all the major chains were coming here, and an independent, even with 5 stores, could not compete. And so he turned this restaurant into the hottest rock and roll club between San Francisco and Los Angeles. He brought live music. He was the first person to integrate a nightclub using music in the valley, which we'll talk a little bit about the middle of California really not being California. It's more Oklahoma or Mississippi or something like that. But my dad decided he was going to integrate this nightclub of his, and in 1972. 1971, the summer of 1971, he brought Chuck Berry to his bar. I wanted so badly to go. He wouldn't let me in, my dad. But he described to me in vivid detail the 2 back-to-back shows that Chuck Berry played and how he duck walked across this tiny stage. Shortly after that, my dad went to work on a Sunday night, right after New Year's, and he was killed by 2 men who came into the bar, the nightclub, when it was practically empty. No robbery, nothing. And it was a murder that was one of the more sensational murders in our town, because my dad was such a well-known athlete. He'd gone to play football at USC and things like that. So here I am at the age of 14. My father's been ripped away from me, and I really know nothing about the place. I know nothing about our family. And this is when I go back to my 2 grandfathers with a tape recorder at the age of 14, 15, and start asking them questions that their own children never asked. Who are we? Where did we come from? Well, we were Armenians, and both my grandfathers were survivors of the first genocide of the 20th century. My grandfather, Mark Arax, was a poet who ended up at the age of 14, 15, hiding in an attic in Constantinople to hide from the Turks. And he took up with him his books of French poetry, Verlaine, the Symbolists, Baudelaire, Maupassant. And this is how he read and lived up there and outlasted 3 years of genocide. When he came down, he had a chance to go to the Sorbonne to study. And this is when these letters began to arrive from Fresno, California, from his uncle, who had lost everybody in the genocide and landed in Fresno because it looked like Anatolia, ancient Armenia, valley and rivers serving it. And he started telling my grandfather, really singing the myth of California. We're starting a new Armenia here, he said. Coffee houses and libraries and this agriculture that you can't believe. The grapes are so large they hang like hen eggs, jade eggs, and the watermelons are so big that when you scoop out the meat, you could ride down the irrigation canals and the shells. So really, my grandfather was being sold, come here with this myth, the myth that grew Los Angeles with the oranges. And so he had a choice in 1920, either going to the Sorbonne in Paris, France, or coming to Fresno, California. And he chose Fresno. He took the bait. He lands here, and his uncle picks him up in a Model T Ford, takes him to the edge of the San Joaquin River, where a man named J.C. Faulkner is planting the biggest fig orchard in the history of mankind, 8 to 10,000 acres of figs. And he's digging into hardpan to do it. Even though this is near the river, it's a weird kind of land that is difficult to get through that layer. And for every tree he plants, I think it's 600,000 fig trees, he has to plant a stick of dynamite to blow apart the hardpan. And this is what greets my grandfather, the sound of bombing, okay? And so it's a key year that he comes. It's 1920. And he's arrived from he's a land of genocide, and he's landed in the land of genocide. He doesn't realize that yet. And the rivers by 1920 have been wholly taken by agriculture. The gold industrialists ended up on Nob Hill in San Francisco, basically deciding that they were going to buy the middle of California and plant wheat. One gentleman in particular, Isaac Friedlander, who made his fortune selling flour to the gold camps, ends up planting, hundreds of thousands of acres of wheat in the middle of California. Well, when you plant a monoculture like that, it tends to rise and be prolific, and then it ends up withering quite fast because it's stealing a lot of the same nutrients from the soil. And as fast as California becomes the greatest exporter of wheat in the world, it ends up the wheat culture dies, and these big landowners decide they're going to sell land to smaller landholders. And this is my grandfather. He arrives, and that year, the turbine pump is invented, which allows agriculture now to go into the ancient aquifer beneath the ground, beyond the rivers. This aquifer is recharged by the snow melt from the rivers and extract from there. By 1928, my grandfather tells me, when I take that tape recorder to him as a kid, that there's a great drought in California, and the explosion of agriculture cannot be sustained by the taking of the river water and now the taking of the groundwater, because it's gone too deep. The groundwater has sunk beyond the capacity of these pumps. And this is during a great drought in the 1920s. And the rural folks end up going to their legislators and saying, you need to bring us an outside river to the San Joaquin Valley so we can continue this great agriculture. Well, there was an example of a place taking a river beyond its backyard rivers, and that was Los Angeles. About a decade earlier, LA had kind of run out of its kind of puny LA River and went up and over the mountain 30 miles to steal the water from the Owens River, the Owens Valley. This became the famous movie Chinatown. So borrowing from that program, that kind of political campaign, the middle of California then persuades the whole of California and the federal government to build a water project called the Central Valley Project. And no project in human history has moved that kind of water from where the snow and rain fall to where the desert is. That was built in the 1930s and 40s, but it came out of the drought of the 20s. In the 50s, in response to flooding up north, it was decided that we were going to build a state water project to twin up with the Central Valley Project. And those two projects together are the system. And the State Water Project is what built the 444-mile concrete river that flows from the Delta through the valley, up and over the mountain into LA. These two together, the CVP and the SWP, become the system. But they're built at a time when there's 13, 14 million Californians. Today, there are 40 million Californians. Not just drought and flood, which is California's DNA, but now climate change. And thus, we are standing where we're standing right now.
Okay. You mentioned your father a little bit earlier, and this book is a little bit memoir, but it's memoir in a very sneaky way. I mean, I know you wrote
Yes.
a memoir about your father. I hadn't read it prior to this book, and so I was sort of taken by surprise. There's one paragraph there. It's not even the lead paragraph of a section, and it's not even the lead sentence in a paragraph. It's a paragraph about canals, and you just sort of tossed in the middle of this paragraph that the folks who murdered your father hid the gun and the vehicle, the getaway vehicle, in a canal, and that
They
really
dumped it in the aqueduct, in the California aqueduct. Yes.
it took me by surprise to sort of I mean, obviously something that is so crucial to your life just kind of made a very brief appearance and then disappeared again. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about how you thought about putting yourself into this narrative, which is about so many incredibly large themes. How did you think about the memoir aspect of this book?
So what I do in this book is every 100 pages, I come back to the murder in a very kind of cryptic way. You're right. But at the end of it all, I think someone understands what that unsolved crime, and then my first book, kind of solving the crime 30 years later, has done to me, and this search to try to find out, what is this place? Who are we? I kind of start all my books in my backyard, and this one starts with my apricot trees in the backyard. So the memoir element, the thing that I had written a book with a friend of mine, Rick Wartzman, The King of California, which is really how the plantation South, the cotton, the mint juleps, the black cotton pickers came from south to west in the Tulare Lake Basin, the transplanting of the cotton plantation in the middle of California, which finally explained to me the twang that was on all my friends' tongues, okay, and ended up being on my tongue too. So, so the memoir is me trying to figure out this place, and I kind of, I'm putting together these pieces, and it starts off with, the mystery of my dad's murder. So I think what motivated me after, so that book, The King of California, I thought, I never want to write about water again. In fact, I kind of purged it all from my brain. It's just way too complicated. And to tell a narrative that's compelling when you have to deal with the complexity of water is nearly impossible. But when the drought hit of 2014, these journalists were coming in, parachuting in from all over mostly from the East Coast, and they were getting a lot of fundamental things wrong. And so I decided that, it was time to maybe do the book of water in California and take it beyond the valley to the whole of California. So that was my motivation. And I decided that I can't write this as a journalist parachuting in. I live in this place. My family story is woven into the taking of the resource of water. And so I went back and I visited our farms. Our last ranch was along the San Joaquin River itself. And so it was very difficult to write that as a journalist. So I decided that, I wasn't a journalist. I was kind of a native son trying to puzzle out a place, a family, and then the whole of this of water and its invention, and really the myth of California.
There are a bunch of different types of journalism in this book. I mean, in the beginning, you're probably doing archival research, on the early settlers in California. Then you have the kind of sort of muckraking big business journalism to look at the Resnicks. And then you have the sort of personal, small scale narrative journalism to talk to, one individual farmer who's just trying to farm his family's 960 acres or whatever it is. Is there a part of that you like more? Did you find it difficult to go back and do the earlier stuff? I mean, it's a very different kind of skill set.
So I think all my books have attempted to meld memoir, journalism, some of the strategies and devices of fiction. I move a lot of furniture around. Every fact has to be correct. But, when you're telling, I met the Stuart Resnick, for instance, the biggest farmer in America who uses the most water of any individual, he and his wife, when you add up their farms of anyone else. I went in there, probably I spent 12 different occasions with him, scenes. But, you can only have a couple of those scenes in a book. And so you end up, putting it all in a way that is true to all those encounters, and yet is something that doesn't try the patience of the reader too much. So I move in and out with, and I basically kind of tell the reader at the outset, here's what I'm trying to do. I don't know really where I stand in all this. I have a sense. I'm not completely dumb to the place, but I'm willing to be moved by all the things I encounter along the way. And so it becomes a kind of, interrogation of the land and the people. Very easy to demonize Stuart Resnick from afar, or high up as you're looking at this empire and saying, my God, two people control this whole thing, and they're using all this water, and they keep growing and growing, no matter drought or flood. But then when you get up close, it complicates your viewpoint. And so, so I use those encounters and trying to write them in a way that's literary to get at the complexity of them. And sometimes people want me to declare myself more. I think you let Stuart Resnick off the hook there, they will say. And perhaps I did, but I just think it gets very complex. And I don't want to be preaching, although there are times in the book where I am. And I don't want to be declaring something that's very nuanced for the sake of the narrative. I don't want to broad brush it in a way. So yeah, it's a challenging thing. And the other thing is, when you're in the middle of something like this, you go mad. I mean, when I look at the book now, I mean, there's a kind of madness that propels it. It's crazy. It's a crazy book because it's trying to capture a crazy place.
Yeah. I've done some magazine journalism myself, and the only story that I ever completely flamed out on and disappointed my editor was when they assigned me to write a profile of essentially of the Westlands Water District, and I went back to them and said, "Can I have an additional 2 years and $100,000?" And I said, "I can't write this story. It's too complicated." And reading this book, I'm sort of reminded of the quote from the political journalist Michael Kinsley about the scandal isn't what's illegal, the scandal is what's legal. And looking at the Resnicks and Westlands, is there any way that these mega corporations can be, the system that they've created in their interest can be bent to work for all Californians or for the environment in general, or is it just too complicated at this point and too entangled?
So I took 3 chapters in the book to try to capture Westlands, and I'm not sure I got it all down. So yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I think as you look at the footprint of agriculture moving from something that's sustainable that is grossly not sustainable today, you see it go from the giants of agriculture to smaller farming and then getting bigger again. And when you look at the San Joaquin Valley, which is 6 million acres of farmland, Okay, and it's the most industrialized of farming. As you move north beyond the Delta, the farming gets a little more sane. But when you look at that, you see that there are three valleys going on in the San Joaquin Valley. There's the east side, which I drove my German translator Eva to the other day, and it's beautiful. It's along the mountains there, and in citrus quilts all the hillsides. And because citrus is a good crop that brings back a lot of return, you can own 40, 60 acres and raise an entire family and accumulate some wealth that way. And so when you go to the east side, where the rivers run through the land, you see that the children of the farm owners and the children of the farm workers go to school together. And I won't call it a Jeffersonian ideal of agriculture, but it's pretty close. And then you move to the Center Valley, where the rivers kind of flow their best and they recharge the groundwater, and you see something that's even closer to a Jeffersonian ideal. And these are the towns of Selma, the raisin capital of the world, and Fowler and Kingsburg, that was founded by Swedes. And the farms are smaller, and they tend to be grape vineyards, raisin fields, some mixture of fruit and nuts and things like that. And the groundwater is at 100 feet deep. So it's reachable. The children of the farmers go to school with the children of the farm workers. They play on the same football teams under these Friday night lights that have been carved out of the raisin vineyards. Then you go 40 miles west to Westlands, and you see, oh my goodness, there's no river here. The only thing serving it is the aqueduct. And the farmers don't live in the land. They live 40 miles away, 50 miles away in a zip code in Fresno, 93711. And because they don't live in the land, they have a kind of psychic distance from that land. And their ownership is weird. They don't feel a kind of obligation to the communities there on the west side. And so you have these little towns, Huron, and Mendota and others, where there's a great deal of poverty, and the water has to be extracted when that water isn't running in the aqueduct because of drought. Water has to be extracted from 1,000 to 2,000 feet deep in the earth, and the ground is sinking because of that extraction. The aqueduct itself has sunk wholly in parts, so that the gravity flow that it depends on to move that water from the delta through the valley up and over the mountain, the gravity flow has been lost too. And so we're spending a ton of money, Californians, on electricity to pump that water through the dead spots. So in 50 miles, you've gone from an agriculture that's sustainable and is actually beautiful, maybe not as beautiful as Sonoma and Napa, but beautiful, to an agriculture that is almost completely extraction. And now with all the nuts, it's become highly mechanized. And so anyhow, that's the complication of the land and the systems. And what's happening is in Westlands and in larger areas where there isn't necessarily river water running through the ground, and it depends on these systems, you're now seeing hedge funds, pension funds, the Canadian Royal Mounties, the Mormon Church buying up huge tracts of ground. And I think it's a play for water, because I don't know that the agriculture they're trying pencils out. But it almost doesn't matter, because they're looking for a loss on the books, maybe to compensate for the gains they have somewhere else. So we're seeing that happening now, where we're not even going to be able to control our own water, and it's going to be a different kind of Chinatown.
Mm-hmm. All right, a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap it up and throw it open to our folks on the Zoom here. A lot of this book is about what's wrong with California water and what's wrong with California agriculture. And, at the end of the book, you talk to a gentleman you refer to as the Oracle, who gives a handful of suggestions for how to fix things. And, some of them seem monumentally difficult, like clearing out the brush in the Sierras so that it will hold more snow. And then some seem, possibly more realistic, like cutting out a certain number of acreage under development. Realistic if you're not the one who owns that acreage and is hoping to make money off it. But I do feel like you struck a bit of a hopeful note at the end, and that you think there are some solutions. And so I'd love you just to sort of noodle a little bit about what you think the future of agriculture in California is, and whether some of these problems can be solved.
The last thing I want to see is agriculture in California, in the middle of California, become what happened in the San Fernando Valley, just paved over with houses and mini malls. We have some of the greatest, most fertile earth anywhere. We have these rivers that run through the land. We have this climate, which is changing, but it's still a Mediterranean climate that could grow 300 different crops. So you don't want to see agriculture lost in the middle, but you need to see a more sane version of agriculture. The law, that groundwater extraction law, is going to affect now. It had a 20-year lead-in. And if it's done right, the state of California will probably compel these irrigation districts to retire. I'm thinking 1 to 1.5 million acres of farmland. So that's going to give us some more water that can go down the rivers, return some land to their natural state. We have these dairies in California, these mega dairies, 20,000 heads of Holsteins. They don't pencil out. They are the biggest polluter of air in the San Joaquin Valley, which happens to be the worst air basin in America. We can't breathe this stuff anymore that comes off the dairies. It is a huge polluter of the groundwater, nitrates in the groundwater. And then if you add up the water use that goes into dairying, raising all the silage that you need to feed the cows, there is no enterprise in agriculture that uses more water than dairies. The San Joaquin Valley isn't really friendly to dairies. I mean, the cows at least. They die in these heat waves. And so really, for happier cows, as the commercial goes, I think the mega dairies need to move to other states where the water and land isn't so valuable. And then we can have smaller family-run dairies that are just fine here. So that's another thing. Desalinization, I think, has a part, although it's very expensive and it has its own environmental consequences. We need to change our way of growing. I did a story in Paradise right after the fires, about 3 months. I drove up there, and I had a sense that communities were growing in the path of wildfire. I saw it in the mountains outside of Fresno. But I didn't realize that a quarter of the population of California was living in the wildfire kind of urban interface there. And when you went to Paradise, I was driving up from Chico up this highway called the Skyway, and it's truly a skyway. You're looking at the sky. And you realize as you climb up it that you're climbing up a geological kind of chimney. On one side is a river canyon, on another side is a river canyon, and here's this narrow ledge where the county of Butte has planted 40,000 people right in the path of wildfire. The town of Paradise had been wiped off the map, essentially, and folks were rallying to build again right there. And so, at some point, and this goes to your question at the outset, maybe what we're doing for water, where the state is getting involved and telling the locals, hey, you need to come up with something sustainable. The state needs to do the same thing with planning and building. So we're not continuing to populate these areas that are just going to burn again.
Yeah. So one last question, you live in Fresno, you grew up in Fresno. Fresno is sort of the hub of the wheel that your life revolves around. I feel the same way about Oakland. I write about Oakland. I live in Oakland. And another thing we have in common is that Oakland and Fresno are constantly the butt of everyone's jokes in California. And we have a chip on our shoulders about our cities. And I'll defend Oakland to any comers. And so I just would like to to ask you what you love about Fresno. Tell us, give us your pitch for Fresno. Tell us why it's a city that has kept you for so long when you could have gone anywhere.
As a kid, my grandfather was friends with the great writer William Saroyan, and as a kid, I would go visit his little track house not too far from where I'm at right now. He would spend half his time in Paris and half in Fresno, and a fascinating man. And he basically talked about writing. He talked about how I said it seems to be lonely, and he says, yes, it's lonely, but it's not an abject loneliness. And I would tell him things like, I'm collecting a bunch of new words. I've got a vocabulary list now, 1,000 of them. And he said, well, like what? And I said, well, like ubiquitous, for instance. He said, what the hell are you going to ever need the word ubiquitous for? He said, count my stories. I use 300 words. That's all. He says, it's not the variety of words you have and that you use. It's the music you put to those words. So as I read more of his stuff, I saw that he had a love-hate with this place. And this is the place that formed him, that shaped him. And so much of his literature came back to this place. But there was an anger, and I think he was better at kind of sublimating it than I am. He kind of, and maybe it spoke to his time. But it was there. It was an anger. And so I love the sun here. I love the soil here. I love the crops that grow here. I love the fact that when I drive downtown, I could see the church that my maternal grandfather preached in, the Armenian red brick church. And I could go a couple miles and see our first farm. And so I'm in touch with all that history. And yet there's not a year that goes by that I'm not looking at real estate somewhere else and threatening to leave. So, and who knows, I may. I may.
Well, let me recommend Oakland.
Yeah, but listen, I'm not giving up this place as a canvas to tell stories. If God willing, if I get some more years, the next 3 books are all going to be something about this place, even the fictional one.
That's great. Well, you've definitely done a service to California and to Fresno and your hometown. So I want to thank you for this conversation. I'm going to throw it open to any other folks here who have questions. I also want to recognize the bear shirt you're wearing. I appreciate that. That's very very on the nose. So thanks for that. So anybody have questions? I'm going to see if I can see you all. You can either raise your literal hand or your computerized hand, or put anything in the chat. If not, that's okay too.
It always takes a few brave souls. Yeah, go ahead.
Mason over here has a question for you.
But you can read it. I typed it.
Mason.
Okay. So, Mark, from your perspective in Fresno, is another story that's interesting for you the high-speed rail story and how it affects the Central Valley, or is that something that's just sort of not that interesting to you?
I don't think you can bring poetry to the high-speed rail story. And I'm not even sure it would allow for anything that was, lyrical or literary. It's a straight up, investigative thing. I used to do those back in the day when I was at the LA Times. I told the story of the entire California prison system and how they were setting up inmates in Gladiator Day fights and then shooting them dead. I think it's, I don't know what to make of that thing. The last piece I read, seemed like a straight up boondoggle. I see this thing rising, and I don't know if it's ever going to, have passengers and all that. It's a weird thing. So no, I don't want to touch it. No.
Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Mark, enjoyed the book. Thank you. You talked about the law. But how about economics? It seems to me that one of the behaviors that's going on here in terms of the use and misuse of water is related to the distortion that occurs because no one actually pays for the water, the substance itself. They pay for the conveyance, They pay for the lift out of the ground if they're pumping groundwater. They pay for the treatment, but they don't pay for the water themselves. And if that in and of itself has its own host of problems, but if a price were charged for the water, you'd start to see some different behaviors, wouldn't you?
Well, you are. There is a water market, and yes, those charges that you talked about are worked into the total. But then there's a whole additional amount that is being charged for the water. So what you're seeing now is you're seeing farmers in parts of the San Joaquin Valley that are having difficulty getting water, making deals with rice farmers up in Northern California. They're basically saying, hey, look, we're growing pistachios and almonds and mandarins. It's making a pretty good return. Why don't you idle some rice land, send us the water, and we will partner up. So you're seeing a market emerge, and it's a bit worrisome because when the hedge funds and pension funds get a hold of this market, you wonder what they're going to do. Are they going to sell the water up and over the mountain to LA so it can continue its suburbanization across the desert? No, there's, I think this last year you were seeing water selling from Northern California to the middle of California for $700, $800, $1,000, maybe even more, an acre foot. So so I think the market might help, but I'm afraid that when it gets into too few hands, it's going to be manipulated, not unlike, what's happened to the land itself, the soil itself.
Anyone else? Questions? Comments? All right, well then, I want to thank you again, Mark. We really appreciated this talk. This book is gonna, I think, be the definitive history of California water for at least a few more years until everything changes again, because there is no average here in California, as you pointed out. And I appreciate so much your time and all your work on this. And then thank
Zach,
you all.
you challenged me with some questions, man. That was good. It was good. Usually I go into some rote kind of thing, and I couldn't do that here. So you kept me honest and had me stammering a bit here and there, but thank you. And I think what you guys done is really special. So I appreciate the effort.